Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, on my channel, it has been a tremendous honor to present and help people better understand the existing research about hair loss treatments. Our hair is a very important part of our identity that has many cosmetic benefits, but also has many practical benefits as well, such as protecting our scalp from the sun, or helping keep our head warm when it's cold outside. But more than that, if you watch my last video, you'll know that having a good head of hair also benefits both our mental health as well as our social standing amongst our peers. As such, people deserve good information about the steps they should take when they elect the option to fight back against this genetic curse and save themselves from becoming yet another bald and bearded clone who will forever be known amongst his friends and peers and strangers as, quote, that bald guy, unquote. As it stands, though, it isn't enough to just interpret and present quality research about clinically proven treatments. Hair loss is a massive industry, and whenever there is an opportunity for making money, you can rest assured there will always be industrial predators and hairline fraud cells more than willing to prey on desperate consumers who are willing to try anything. So sometimes you have to wonder how it is that so many hair loss scams still exist when we have two extremely effective and safe clinically proven treatments available on the market in the form of finasteride and minoxidil. Both of these have been on the market since the early 90s and the late 80s. So how is it that anybody would even consider some phony alternative treatment with no scientific evidence when we have clinically proven treatments that have undergone the most rigorous safety and efficacy testing in the entire world? Well, hairline fraud cells are aware that their products have no chance against clinically proven treatments when it comes to actual evidence-based research. So their strategy is to lure consumers into wasting money on their garbage by spreading misinformation and fear about clinically proven treatments so that hair loss sufferers don't even consider them as viable options. The best way to make sure that consumers fall for such scams is to convince them that conventional and clinically proven methods for fighting hair loss like finasteride minoxidil are either too dangerous or not necessary, and instead they'll offer some quote-unquote natural alternative. Your average consumer is not someone who does a lot of research, and they can easily be manipulated by low-quality data that presents an appealing narrative that will be just persuasive enough that they will ignore the scientifically backed treatments in favor of dubious remedies supported by unverified or sometimes even implausible theories. So, oftentimes, in order for a snake oil salesman to sell a product, they have to convince consumers that there is some alternative mechanism behind hair loss which goes beyond simply just blocking DHT on the scalp. They claim that it isn't that simple and that they have some theory which addresses some deeper underlying cause that conventional theories don't address. Usually, these theories relate to what is commonly known these days as the blood flow theory. What this theory purports is that there is a reduction in blood flow due to the compression of scalp arteries from tension in scalp muscles and the fibrous top of the scalp known as the gallia aponeurotica. These areas of scalp tension allegedly correlate with the most frequent patterns seen in male pattern baldness. Originally, the theory held that it was just a lack of oxygen causing hair loss, but when it was discovered that the hair follicles in the scalp were sensitive to the hormone DHT, dihydrotestosterone, the theory was then modified to say that the low oxygen levels increase the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone in the scalp, and this is what causes hair loss in the familiar male pattern baldness that is typically associated with the Norwood pattern scale. This theory suggests that we can therefore lower DHT on the scalp naturally by improving blood circulation, which will deliver more oxygen to the hair follicles and thus lower the amount of DHT on the scalp. As such, there are a lot of people who have promoted gimmick programs and devices designed to improve blood flow to the scalp as a means of stopping hair loss. In fact, these scam products date back to over a century, and those old devices didn't work either, but it does go to show just how outdated this theory is and how outdated the programs, gimmicks, and devices used to promote this theory really are. Now, lots of people have come forth with their own theories about why blood flow is reduced in the scalps of bald men, but the fact of the matter matter is that hair loss is not caused by low blood flow. It is known that blood flow is reduced in the scalps of bald men, but that's a consequence of hair loss, not a causation. It is a consequence of DHT destroying the capillary beds that subsequently causes the destruction of hair follicles. Scar tissue takes the place of the hair follicles, and scar tissue is made out of collagen, which is nearly avascular, and thus you don't need as much blood supply in a bald scalp compared to a scalp with a full head of hair. And this really shows what utter and complete broccoli the blood flow theory really is, because in the normal human body, the blood supply will always adjust itself to provide adequate oxygen when circumstances change in the tissues. To think that the scalp somehow loses blood vessels in balding men and that this is the thing that's causing them to lose their hair just goes against everything we know about biology and human anatomy. If there is an area of low oxygen in the body, there is always a stimulus to new capillary and blood vessel growth. Otherwise, you'd see your scalp skin become necrotic and slough off if the blood supply really was inadequate. We also know that scalp tension cannot cut off blood supply because the arteries that supply blood to the scalp are located above the muscles of the head. As you can see, these arteries are all interconnected, so even if some were obstructed, it wouldn't matter because it would just cause increased blood flow in the other arteries. That is why people can even get arteries ligated, like in the case of the superficial temporal artery, which they'll do for cosmetic reasons, and sometimes that can bulge out so much that it's torturous for some individuals. And even this does not cause hair loss due to the redundancy of the scalp's vascular network. If you lose one artery, the others compensate, so there is no reduction to the scalp's blood supply even when some of the arteries are obstructed. We'll talk about more of this in the course of the video, but if you really want an in-depth examination as to why the blood flow theory is bogus and why maneuvers intended to increase blood flow to the scalp, like scalp massages, do not work, then I'll go ahead and post several videos I have made on these subjects where I go over scalp massages and the blood flow theory all below. So, the blood flow theory is an ancient and obsolete theory that is no longer taken seriously by the medical community at all. But there are still attempts by some people to revitalize this outdated theory and make it marketable again for the sake of their own financial interests. This modernized approach to the blood flow theory is based mostly on the speculation of two individuals. The first one is Rob English, who is responsible for this article, which promotes the idea of scalp massages as being a means to promote blood flow to the scalp and therefore treating hair loss, and the other one is Paul Taylor. And even though, like Rob English, he also believes in the blood flow theory, he adds another layer of absurdity on top of this theory by saying that hair loss is caused by the structure of our skulls, and he calls this the skull expansion theory. So, even though Rob English and Paul Taylor present some different ideas, there is a lot of overlap in their ridiculous theories, and thus we often see these two cited the most when people try to qualify the blood flow theory with scientific arguments. So obviously, I think both of these guys are full of broccoli, but in the case of Rob English, he at least promotes some ideas that are grounded in reality. Like, for example, I don't think Rob English would ever go so far as to deny the androgen hypothesis. Paul Taylor, on the other hand, provides info that is about as scientifically useful as buying a book by Gwyneth Paltrow from Whole Foods. He is a bro scientist to the extreme who only believes in natural treatments. And if you take a look at his website, you see him promoting all sorts of debunked New Age woo that has been debunked oftentimes even by my own channels, such as onion juice or even weirder things like gravity exercise, as opposed to exercises that don't use gravity, right? He also supports magnet therapy. Where have I heard of that one before? Oh yeah, that's right, from the 19th fucking century. How novel of an idea is that one? Well, anyways, my first impression when seeing Paul Taylor was that he looks a lot like Michael Palin from The Life of Brian. Also, like Rob English and many other people who claim to have their own answers to fight hair loss, it is questionable whether Paul Taylor really has androgenic alopecia to begin with. The only documentation he provides for this is this one before and after picture, which shows the side of his scalp from one angle. In the before picture, it's questionable whether or not he even has any temporal thinning, and the hairstyle looks a bit combed forward, so we can't really properly evaluate it to begin with. In the after picture, his hair is styled differently, and his head is tilted more forward, giving us a different angle. Also, the lighting is darker, and the image is blurry, which makes it harder to see its scalp. So it's clear this guy is just bullshitting us, and he doesn't actually have androgenic alopecia to begin with. So even though he definitely deserves it, it looks looks like nature has spared him from the slaphead curse, but he is still using his hair anyways as a means of selling his crappy book, which is basically just a necronomicon of all sorts of hair loss bro science. But mostly, this book focuses on his medieval proto-scientific skull shape manipulation alchemical techniques, which he claims saved his hair, and is the true secret to hair loss that thousands of more qualified people who have done far more research than him somehow haven't figured out yet. Nevertheless, despite the savage stupidity of his book titled Here Today, Hair Tomorrow, and his website called hairlosssos.com, he has still built a reputation in the hair loss community, and his book is frequently cited by bro scientists on hair loss forums, and sadly is sometimes even taken seriously, which is yet another reason why you should never visit hair loss forums. Well, shockingly, Paul Taylor somehow managed to get an article published on his skull expansion theory in a medical journal called Medical Hypotheses. When I heard the name of the journal, I knew it sounded familiar because, as it turns out, this is the very same journal that Rob English got his own paper published in. Like Rob English, Paul Taylor has no formal medical training, so maybe this journal is just a safe space for all the medical rejects and failures in the world of hair loss research. As it turns out, this Medical Hypotheses journal is indeed intended for publication of just very speculative opinion pieces. The editors of this journal state that the journal will publish, quote, some hypotheses where experiment support is yet fragmentary, unquote. This actually is a very obscure medical journal. When comparing the importance of medical journals, you look at what's called the impact factor, meaning how often is it cited by other journals. The journal Medical Hypotheses has an impact factor of only 1.538. You can compare this to a more well-known journal like the New England Journal of Medicine, which has an impact factor of 70.67. Moreover, this Medical Hypotheses journal is ranked 11,208 out of medical journals in terms of importance. Not only that, you have to pay money to publish in this journal, a sum of $1,850. So basically, if you have the cash, you can get any bullshit you want published in this journal. So your idea doesn't have to make any sense or have any value, you just have to have enough money to bribe this journal to publish it. So that's excellent news for imposter researchers like Paul Taylor. In fact, someone should tell that broccoli guy on Reddit that instead of scamming people for $70,000 to make some worthless broccoli juice topical, he only needs to raise $1,850 on his Patreon, and then even he can get an article published, quote, the theory that explains everything, and then maybe some people will take him seriously. So like I said though, Paul Taylor doesn't have a medical background. He has a degree in civil engineering, and he was also a pilot in the Royal Air Force. He is also qualified as a math teacher and a tennis coach. The only thing that he has that is vaguely related to medicine are degrees in nutrition and sports psychology. Now, I'm not trying to be condescending here. It's not like I'm a doctor either, but remember, I'm not the one proposing some radical new theory that overturns the medical consensus. Thinking you know more about hair loss than the world's brightest doctors, chemists, and pharmacists when you don't even have any medical training yourself is the peak of arrogance. That is why on my channel, I promote the medical consensus on hair loss, because I know I don't know better than doctors and research scientists on this subject. So anyways, let's go ahead and take a look at his famous article published in 2009 in the bargain basement medical journal Medical Hypotheses with the very whimsical title, quote, Big Head, Bald head, skull expansion, alternative model for the primary mechanism of androgenic alopecia, unquote. The title makes it sound more like an Onion article than a medical article, but let's see what this skull expansion idea is all about. So, in this article, Paul Taylor starts off by saying that there is a debate about what the true cause of androgenic alopecia is. He says that androgenic alopecia is somehow related to DHT, but then he says, quote, the actual mechanism that explains how DHT causes androgenic alopecia is subject to speculation, unquote. To be fair, this article was published in 2009, and now in 2021, we know a lot more about how DHT causes hair loss. We know that in people with the genetics for androgenic alopecia, that the balding hair follicles have increased androgen receptor activity and higher 5-AR activity, which results in higher levels of DHT in these hair follicles as opposed to hair in non-balding regions. We now know that different levels of DHT have effects on the Wnt pathway and on hair growth factors like TGF-beta1 that end up causing hair loss. None of this was well established yet back in 2009, so maybe Paul Taylor could have been excused back then for believing that something besides DHT could cause androgenic alopecia. But it's almost the year 2022, and he should know better by now, because we now have even more overwhelming evidence that it is scalp DHT that triggers off a whole cascade of biochemical events that lead to the destruction of the hair follicles in men who have androgenic alopecia, as well as women. So it is well established by research that indeed it is scalp DHT that is the central culprit for hair loss, and this hair loss is genetically determined. But this fact doesn't benefit his business model, so of course he would never acknowledge it. And indeed, most of his website is still devoted to promoting his skull expansion theory of hair loss, even in the year 2021. Paul Taylor then states, quote, "For men, androgenic alopecia will always develop within what appears to be a predetermined area of the scalp," unquote. Wrong, Paul Taylor. Sorry, son, you have failed. The fact of the matter is that even though the Norwood pattern we typically associate with pattern hair loss is the most common pattern seen in men, there are men with androgenic alopecia who lose hair in irregular patterns. We see this in the case of people who have diffuse unpatterned hair loss, as well as people who have retrograde alopecia who will actually lose hair in the donor region. These causes of hair loss are less common, but they are still androgenic and can be effectively treated with the use of a 5-AR inhibiting drug like finasteride. The only difference between sufferers of diffuse thinning or retrograde alopecia compared to people with standard male pattern baldness is just that their hair follicles are programmed differently, with the androgen sensitivity hairs being in different parts of the scalp. Paul Taylor, on the other hand, says all men will have the same pattern of baldness, but he's of course completely wrong. A simple Google search would have disproven this, and yes, Google did still exist in 2009. I should know, I'm 40 years old. So his hypothesis is that the bones of the human skull continue to grow as people age. Because of this skull expansion, he claims, quote, "Skull expansion of the frontal and parietal bones will progressively stretch and pull tight the scalp tissues that overlies it. A constriction of blood vessels within the capillary network that serves the male pattern baldness region will subsequently develop. The resultant decrease in blood flow that follows will then reduce the supply of nutrients required by follicles to grow hair," unquote. The only evidence he cites to prove this theory is, quote, "This is supported by the initial observations which revealed that the skull often appears larger and more bulbous in shape for those who experience severe androgenic alopecia relative to those who do not," unquote. So basically, what he did is he just opened a goddamn window and looked outside and made an observation and then concluded that bald people must have bigger skulls because their heads appear more bulbous. Well, gee, I wonder why a bald person's skull would appear more prominent than someone with a full head of hair. Maybe because there's no fucking hair there, you bloody imbecile? When there's no hair on someone's scalp, it is obviously going to make their skull look more bulbous. Maybe I'm being a bit unfair here, though. I mean, he did get his paper published, so certainly he must have gone ahead and at least done something like skull measurements, right? Maybe he performed some skull x-rays or MRI scans, or maybe he just used some tape measurement to compare the skull sizes between balding and non-balding men. You know, something a real researcher would do, and not someone who pays a Z-list medical journal to get junk research published. Well, I went over the article with a fine-tooth comb and then double-checked it, and as it turns out, he didn't do any of that. Not a single goddamn thing. His whole theory has zero data backing it. It is all based on just his own impression when he walks outside or something. This would be like saying white skin causes baldness because more Caucasians go bald than black people. Even if there was some correlation, it would not prove causation any more than saying that high estrogen levels are more likely to make you commit stolen valor, and then bringing up Jason Blum as an example. Anyways, the reason why the skull expansion theory is directly tied into the blood flow theory is because it hypothesizes that as the skull expands, it causes the arteries which supply blood to the scalp to drift further and further apart as the skull gets bigger. And Paul thinks that based on the location of these arteries, this is what causes hair loss to occur in a pattern as we commonly see in male pattern baldness. So this might seem interesting if the highest grade level you ever achieved was the second grade and your only academic achievement was a gold star your teacher gave you for correctly identifying a potato as a vegetable, but this is otherwise extremely amateurish stuff that anyone who knows anything about anatomy and human physiology can quickly deduce as being bullshit with a minimal amount of research. Even worse for Paul, though, is the fact that this thesis is not even anatomically possible to begin with, because the growth of the skull is a very slow process. In fact, it takes years for any visible changes to happen at all, so the only way for Paul's claim to be true would be if the growth of the skull outpaced the development of the blood vessels, which is not even physiologically possible. Just like skull bones, arteries, veins, and capillaries grow too. The arteries will grow as we grow, and any changes in the shape and size of the skull will also cause the arteries to grow to accommodate any new scalp tissue. As we already saw in this diagram, there are multiple interconnected arteries which serve or deliver blood to the scalp, and because of this interconnection between the arteries, the blood supply throughout the scalp is very redundant. When the skull gets bigger, these arteries also get bigger, just like any other part in our body. So relatively speaking, there is no less blood supply in a big scalp versus a small scalp. It is all proportional. Also, if expansion of the parietal and frontal bones cause baldness, then why wouldn't the expansion of the other major bone, the occipital bone, cause baldness in the occipital region, namely in the back of the head, which is usually spared even in people who are full-blown Norwood 7s. Now, Paul Taylor tries to address this briefly by saying that the occipital bone doesn't expand, but he provides no evidence for this, and it doesn't make any sense, especially since, as we established earlier, people can lose hair in these regions, such as people who have retrograde alopecia. So are these people just rare examples of people who have expansion in the occipital region of the scalp? Obviously, this is not the case. Their hair follicles are just programmed differently than most people who have androgenic alopecia. So Paul Taylor, in an attempt to look fair, I guess, then lists the evidence in favor and against the skull expansion hypothesis. First, he says that the expansion of the frontal and parietal bones correlates with the area of balding, though if you look at the picture of these bones, the correlation is not that exact. The horseshoe pattern usually overlaps a lot of the area of the parietal bones. The bottom line, though, is that the correlation is fairly rough between the anatomy of the bones and the pattern of male pattern baldness, especially since, as we've established, people who have androgenic alopecia don't always lose hair in this pattern, contrary to what Paul Taylor says. There are also people who don't have a particularly big head who are still completely bald. A famous example of this would be the last Soviet premier, Mikhail Gorbachev. Also, a condition called acromegaly in people like Andre the Giant causes larger than normal skulls, but Andre was genetically blessed with a full head of hair despite this. Now, Paul Taylor on his website makes some bullshit arguments about Andre the Giant, and he now says it is more the shape of the head that is important rather than the size of the skull. But the point is that it is easy to find exceptions to his skull expansion theory, and even Rob English in his website points this out, though he still ends up liking this theory nevertheless. And like I said earlier, everybody is going to look like they have a bigger head when they have no hair on their head, since more of their scalp will be visible. The next thing he says that is in favor of his hypothesis is that the rate of hair loss correlates well with the rate of skull expansion, but he never actually measured any skulls, so this is a claim he's pulling right out of his ass. He has absolutely no comparable metrics to make such a claim. Then, the next point he tries to make in favor of his hypothesis is that both androgenic alopecia and skull expansion have a genetic basis. Okay, and this matters why exactly, Mr. Taylor? I mean, eye color and hair loss have both a genetic basis too, and you could even argue that people with blue eyes are more likely to experience hair loss since blue eyes are more common in Caucasian cultures, and Caucasian people have a higher incidence of hair loss compared to, say, Asian or African cultures. That doesn't mean there's any causation. This is just another example of a correlation equals causation fallacy. Paul then brings up the androgen paradox, and for those who don't know what that is, it's the observation that DHT promotes beard and body hair growth, yet paradoxically destroys hair on the head in people who have androgenic alopecia. Paul Taylor tries to explain this paradox by proposing that the skull expansion is so great that it overcomes the effect of DHT on the hair follicles, and that DHT is actually good for the hair, and the androgen paradox isn't a real thing. He believes that DHT is actually stimulating the bone growth that causes skull expansion, and that the beneficial effects of DHT on the hair cannot overcome the detrimental effects of skull expansion. This might sound interesting, however, we know that DHT is detrimental to genetically susceptible hair regardless of the environment that it is in. In fact, you can remove the skull from the equation completely, yet DHT still destroys the hair follicles. There is research showing that when hair follicles from balding and non-balding areas of the scalps of men with androgenic alopecia are extracted from the scalp and then put in a petri dish, the follicles from the balding region will grow more poorly, suggesting that the surrounding environment is not important for the development of androgenetic alopecia and that hair follicles are indeed pre-programmed. Furthermore, there is even research showing that when hairs from the scalps of balding men were transplanted to the arm, the hair would still miniaturize at the same rate. Also, hairs from the back of the head can be transplanted to the top of the head where supposedly the skull is expanding the most, and these hairs will not experience any further miniaturization. This is why hair transplants work, and even though there are examples of poorly performed hair transplants where hairs will be harvested from regions outside of the donor region and thus still miniaturize, it doesn't change the underlying science behind hair transplants, which is that hair follicles more resistant to DHT can be moved to other regions of the body and still thrive as they would anywhere else. This is strong evidence backed by decades of scientific research dating way back to 1959 when Dr. Orentreich published the first data on hair transplants, yet Paul Taylor doesn't even bring this up. He does bring up some other objections though. Specifically, he notes that increased androgen receptor activity and 5-AR activity have been found in the hair follicles of balding regions, and he admits that this could imply that the hair follicles are pre-programmed to go bald. However, he explains all this away by saying that the increased androgen receptors and 5-AR enzymes are just a response to skull expansion. He says, quote, "It is possible that increased androgen receptor gene expression and 5A reductase activities within the male pattern baldness region may simply result from the body trying to counteract skull expansion through excessive DHT production," unquote. However, he already said that skull expansion was due to DHT production, so it doesn't make any sense that the body would try to produce even more DHT to counteract skull expansion. So basically, the logic that he's using here is that your body tries to stop skull expansion, which is supposedly caused by DHT, by producing more DHT, even though that supposedly causes skull expansion. And for some reason, this excess DHT doesn't cause hair growth, and this is supposedly because the blood flow is too low, even though an increased skull size, as we already established, would also cause increased vascularity in the scalp. I mean, I feel like James Randi here debunking the fucking Magnet Man. This is some really stupid shit here. So, he then brings up the fact that the 5-AR type 2 inhibitors like finasteride work against male pattern baldness, which seems to debunk his skull expansion theory. However, he also says that finasteride actually works by decreasing the effect of DHT in the skull bones and implies that it literally will shrink your skull, allowing your hair to grow. I have to hand it to you, Mr. Taylor. That is literally the dumbest thing regarding hair loss I have ever heard in my entire life. Even HairGuard bringing up an Indian man's arm shrinking after holding it up for 40 years as being proof of the bludflow theory is more believable than finasteride causing skull shrinkage. I even went to the Propecia help forums to see if I could find one person reporting skull shrinkage, and even there, on a forum where people claim that finasteride can make you gay, transgendered, or make your anus numb after inverting your penis, I couldn't find a single case of a person claiming finasteride shrunk their skull. Not one person. There is no research. Zero. Not even a single case report showing that finasteride can shrink your skull. In fact, the existing research on this subject shows that the opposite is true. In a double-blind study of 23 men with benign prostatic hypertrophy, finasteride was shown to have no effect on bone density and bone metabolism. Based on this study, it was concluded that testosterone and estrogen are the active metabolites in bone metabolism, and that DHT has no significant role in bone metabolism, despite what Paul Taylor hypothesizes. And this study was published way back in 1992, so it should have been readily available to him, so he's not off the hook for this sloppily written thesis. Paul Taylor claims to be a teacher, but frankly, if he tried to present this as an actual academic paper to me, I would have given him an F, and then I would have torn the paper up in front of his face before requesting his expulsion. Even someone with a negative IQ level like Callie Muscle could have come up with a better scientific theory than this garbage. So other than this article's frequent appearance in the hair loss forums and subreddits, this article did not shake up the scientific community, and gee, I wonder why. Maybe because it's absolutely terrible? But anyways, in the PubMed entry, only one other article is listed as citing this article, but I did, interestingly enough, find one more article that did cite Paul Taylor's article, and you guys may recognize the name of this person. It's from my #1 biggest fan, the one and only Rob English, and what a big surprise that Rob English would cite research from someone else who supports the blood flow theory just like he does. In fact, the only other place this article is cited is Paul Taylor's website, where he uses it as a big advertisement for his $30 ebook. But like I mentioned, he also brings up a bunch of other debunked natural remedies too. So, for the sake of argument, Let's pretend for a moment we're living in an alternative universe where 1 plus 1 equals 3 and skull expansion really does cause hair loss. Under that pretense, what does Paul Taylor recommend as a means of stopping skull expansion in order to stop hair loss? He recommends scalp massages. Yeah, like we haven't seen that one done before. No wonder Rob English likes this guy so much. So, just like Rob English, Paul Taylor thinks the way to counteract the reduced blood flow to this from skull expansion is to increase blood flow through scalp massages. But as we've already established earlier, blood flow is not inhibited in the scalps of bald men. The reduced blood supply in balding men's scalp is a consequence of hair loss, not a cause, since scar tissue is largely avascular and requires much less blood supply than hair follicles. Additionally, scalp massages would not increase blood flow anyways because the major vessels that supply blood to the hair follicles are located under the epidermis, but on top of the muscles, so the blood vessels are not being obstructed to begin with. I go into this in great detail in my video on why scalp massages do not stop hair loss, but just know that the bottom line is that there is no evidence scalp massages stop hair loss, and the very theory behind why they work is based on a premise we know is wrong, since blood flow is not restricted regardless of whether or not you have a large skull. When tissue expands in the human organism, so do the vascular networks that support that system, and there's no way bone growth can outpace the growth of blood vessel growth. In addition, even though his article was published way back in 2009, there has never been any research done which supports Paul Taylor's skull expansion theory, and there probably never will be, because if even someone like me can point out the extremely blatant absurdities of this theory, imagine what an actual full-blown medical researcher would think. They're not thinking about it though, because they're busy focusing on researching treatments with actual real potential. Nobody cares about your skull expansion theory, and that is why it has been defunct since 2009, and let's be honest, even back then nobody took it seriously. The fact is that the hair loss research has moved on from nonsense like blood flow, skull expansion, scalp tension, dental malocclusion, sulforaphane, and all the other utter broccoli that makes public hair loss forums and subreddits absolutely unbearable to visit these days. The fact is that scientists have accepted the fact that androgenic alopecia is genetically pre-programmed, and that balding scalps are sensitive to DHT, and that is what causes hair loss. Now, a lot of the new research on hair loss is centered on delineating mechanisms whereby DHT does its harm as opposed to just DHT itself, such as looking at the Wnt pathway and other intracellular pathways, and several drugs are in development that target this Wnt pathway, like KY19382, SM04554, as well as WAY316606. These Wnt pathway treatments are legitimately interesting because they target one of the destructive mechanisms that DHT causes without actually inhibiting DHT itself, which means these treatments do hold promise for the very small number of people who cannot tolerate finasteride. There is also plenty of interesting research being done on topical anti-androgens by pharmaceutical companies like Kintor. Kintor is developing treatments like piralutamide and GT20029, which may potentially be breakthroughs in the realm of hair loss research. I have made videos on all of these potential treatments where I have appraised and spoken positively about them. So as positive as I am about finasteride as a first line of defense against androgenic alopecia, nobody should accuse me of not welcoming further innovations in hair loss treatments. But the fact of the matter is that no serious researcher is still looking at blood flow or all the nonsense surrounding the Gallia aponeurotica and its role in hair loss. There is absolutely zero good evidence to support any of these theories, and the only purpose these outdated theories serve is to sell books and scamful products, as well as programs that offer false hope about being able to treat hair loss through natural treatment protocols. People who claim scalp massages work to stop their own hair loss are people who likely never had androgenic alopecia to begin with, and likely experience hair loss from other causes like telogen effluvium, which gets better on its own. They likely misinterpreted this telogen effluvium as being androgenic alopecia, and they then turned to scalp massages, and when their hair loss reversed, which it would have done anyways, they think that it was the scalp massages that did it, and then they go online claiming that scalp massages stopped their hair loss when obviously they did not. This is why you need actual quality scientific research like randomized control trials, and you cannot rely on anecdotal claims because there are no controls put in place to confirm the validity of their claims. For all we know, people who claim scalp massages work for them could be experiencing a placebo effect. They could be getting gains from other causes, or like I said, they may not actually even have androgenic alopecia to begin with, and their hair loss was caused by other factors. Androgenic alopecia is not some enigma where researchers are still trying to figure out exactly what causes it. Androgens, namely dihydrotestosterone, DHT, are what cause hair loss, not scalp tension, not blood flow, not skull expansion. Even if there are some intricacies about hair loss that have yet to be discovered, they are not going to be discovered by random internet nobodies like this guy. The sooner you accept this reality, the sooner you can actually get serious about a hair loss intervention program that works and doesn't involve giving your money away to hairline fraud cells who give you back nothing in return except for false hope based on speculation rather than science. Stop doing stupid shit to stop your hair loss, like standing on your head, taking aspirin, or massaging your scalp like an idiot. Go to your doctor, get on finasteride, forget about hair loss, and get on with your life. Until then, I'll see you next time, my fellow hair loss witchers. Thank you for watching. Take care.